Afternoon, everyone. Welcome back from lunch. So our next presentation is on TLS in SMTP, one of the world's most forgotten services. So I'd like to bring out Jamie Gillespie from ADNIC.
Thanks very much, Billy. Welcome, everyone. It's a bit of a rough gig speaking right after lunchtime when everyone's probably still enjoying some desserts, but thank you very much for attending my session for today. Just a quick overview of what I'm going to be talking about in this session. I'm going to be looking at encryption for SMTP server-to-server, so the TLS side of SMTP. I'm going to be looking, obviously, talking about the importance of SMTP security for those that don't know it already, looking at all the different security options that are there for SMTP servers, the methodology of the research that I was doing, and then the analysis of the security across different aspects. And of course, ending off with some recommendations to hopefully make things better. So looking at the importance of SMTP, email is integral to our work and personal lives. You know, just think about what's in your inbox and your sent mail folders for both work mail and your personal mail. I'm sure you've got plenty of personally identifiable information, credit cards, hopefully more on the personal side and not credit card information in your work email. Health data, again, hopefully not in your work email. But some systems are still sending out passwords via email. You ask for a password reset or forgot my password, and they will actually send you plain text passwords via email. Unfortunately, that's a whole different talk to go into, but that has been done a lot more and hopefully isn't happening as much. We do get OTP codes. As we're moving to more of this passwordless login, there's more and more systems that by default don't let you log in with a password, and they send you the password via email, or they send you a link to click on or a code to type in to prove that you have access to that email account still. And of course, just straight up login links. So a lot of sensitive information is communicated over email. The health data, I was just talking to Billy about this before, that you know, a lot of health providers used to do faxing of information, and that was secure, and now they're moving to email. And it's like, well, that's not that wonderful because there's not a lot of protection around SMTP, as we'll see. So when we look at SMTP security, things are a little bit weird out there. You've got blog posts that are titled, "How to Send Sensitive Information Via Email." Now, sure, they actually have a little bit of useful advice, but they're basically saying it's okay to send sensitive information via email. Not a great thing when by default it's not very secure. Then you have the user perception. You know, the average person using Gmail, they're like, well, I'm connecting to gmail.com using HTTPS, so of course my email is secure. I've got the padlock, everything is secure accessing the web server, so that's the end, right? You also then have to deal with the technical visibility. We have easy tools like Qualys's SSL Labs and many others out there, but SSL Labs I think is probably the most easy and common one to use. Sometimes you'll get a director, manager, CEO even saying, hey, I went to this SSL Labs and I put in our website and we don't have an A+. Can you make it an A+? You know, our competitor has an A+ for security of their website. Why isn't ours an A+ as well? But do they have access to easy websites that give us similar grading and scoring for their mail servers or just any other infrastructure other than their websites? Now, the SMTP server-to-server communication is pretty much completely hidden to the users. You know, where is the padlock for email to show that it's being encrypted? Where is mail to S? Like we have for HTTPS. It just isn't there. Email has no extra layers, has no visibility. It's just sort of fire and forget. Now, SMTP server-to-server comms is using Start TLS. There was arguments and debates amongst the standards years ago on whether there should be a separate port number that is dedicated TLS, that you connect using TLS in the same way that you have HTTPS. That basically lost. The way forward is port 25, unencrypted, and then if the server allows it, you can then negotiate a start TLS and upgrade to TLS encryption. But by default, it starts off unencrypted comms. Now remember, unencrypted comms can then be modified. If there's a man-in-the-middle attack, you can basically block the server's communication to the client saying, I support start TLS, and make it appear that the only option is unencrypted. Man-in-the-middle attacks on the server side, fairly easy to do. DNS cache poisoning, and slightly harder, BGP hijacking. These are things that are already done. There are examples of these types of attacks being done for much larger compromises. There was some cryptocurrency exchanges that actually had a BGP hijacking attack done against them, and a lot of cryptocurrency was stolen from that. Hijacking and doing man-in-the-middle for someone's email probably wouldn't even be noticed. So, if we look at all of this lack of visibility, compare it to a website. If you were logging into yourbank.com.au, how would you feel if silently your connection was actually unencrypted? We're all taught never submit information if it's not encrypted. Always look for the padlock. Web browsers have been deprecating and removing crypto ciphers and crypto versions out of web browsers. You try and do TLS 1.0, you're going to get a warning in a browser. You try and do SSL version 3, it just won't work in most web browsers. But it would on an SMTP server. So let's have a look at some of the different security options that we have for SMTP servers. So the big one here, DANE. DANE stands for DNS-based authentication of named entities. DANE associates TLS certificates with the server, and it does this using DNS records. This allows you to optionally have SSL certificates or TLS certificates that are not signed by a trusted root CA. This basically allows you to have self-signed certificates, not having to worry about Let's Encrypt or all the others and rotations and things like that, especially on some mail servers that may not have web access to do some of these rollovers and that. So yeah, DANE allows you to do self-signed certificates and just carry on with that and do it securely. The way it does this is storing certificate fingerprints in a DNS resource record called TLSA. And when a connection is made, it basically takes the public key off of the server, does a hash of it, compares it against what's in the DNS record, and if it matches, that's fine, it's authoritative, and off you go, you actually use the encryption. Now, of course, because it's using DNS to look up these hashes and fingerprints, it actually requires DNSSEC to work properly. DNSSEC, if you aren't aware, allows for protection of integrity on DNS records by signing all of your DNS records and validating them to make sure that DNS records haven't been modified in transit. The existence of a TLSA record signals to the SMTP servers that TLS, via start TLS, is to be used. Straightforward. Well, not super straightforward because you need DNSSEC. The competing, slightly different way of doing it is with MTA STS, otherwise known as the Mail Transfer Agent Strict Transport Security. MTA STS enables mail service providers to declare their use of TLS, and if TLS is required or optional. This is mainly for testing purposes. Once you go through testing of it being optional, you then go into enforced mode where you're basically saying, only use TLS. If you cannot communicate with my SMTP server with TLS, do not send me mail. Somebody's hijacked the connection, somebody's doing something funky in the middle, don't do it. This is the SMTP equivalent for HSTS. If the STS sounded familiar, it is. It's HSTS for SMTP servers. Now, this is a little bit different to DANE. In addition to a DNS record, DANE publishes the policy on an HTTPS server. Actually, no, sorry, I miswrote that in my slide. MTA STS publishes its policy via an HTTPS server. So not everything is stored in DNS. A little bit is in DNS, sort of like a serial number. And then if things have changed, it goes to the website, pulls down the policy off of the web server. MTA STS requires TLS version 1.2. If you had anything else available on the server, it would not be used, and that is the minimum version level required. And the certificate must be signed by a trusted root CA. So there is some different requirements here. There is not a requirement or a strict requirement for DNSSEC. So that can make MTA STS a little bit easier for organizations that aren't using DNSSEC yet. That said, DNSSEC would be useful here because some data is being transmitted and stored in DNS records, just not the critical parts of it. Now, other sorts of SMTP security options, we've got DKIM for the domain keys identified mail. This is a method of detecting forged or spoofed addressed mail. When an email is sent, it basically is signed with a private key validated from a public key that's stored in a DNS record. Again, here, DNSSEC would come in really handy because you're transmitting semi-critical information over DNS. Now, this is mainly for spoofing and phishing attacks. It's not going to help with server-to-server communication. So it's useful, but it's a little bit out of scope for the main part of the research I was doing for this presentation. Similarly, we have SPF, the Sender Policy Framework. This is the one that most people should be aware of, and spoiler alert for the slides coming up, almost every domain I looked at had SPF records and everything was set up, most of them properly. SPF, email validation, again, designed to prevent spoofing, stores information in text records, which is a list of the authorized hosts that are allowed to send mail on behalf of that domain name. Again, doesn't do anything for server-to-server communication security, but just mentioning it here to get that out of the way and a little bit out of scope. But again, most people are doing it already, so good work. And then we have DMARC. DMARC is, again, another email validation scheme. It also includes some reporting. It basically extends SPF and DKIM to allow for defining how you're checking from addresses, how to handle failures, and also the reporting mechanism of it. Again, great for spoofing and phishing, doesn't have any impact on server-to-server communication. So again, a little bit out of scope for this presentation. But I tell you how many people are using it, though. So let's look at the very brief methodology of how I was going through this. I hacked together some very poorly written Python code that actually ran. I feed it in a list of domain names, goes through, queries out all of their MX records, sees what's being run, querying all the DNS records to pull out anything relating to MTA STS. If there is, pulling down their policy files off of their web servers, comparing the MX records against the policy to make sure they actually set it up properly, if they had it set up at all. Then doing some more DNS queries for TLSA records, DMARC, SPF, and SPF going through and doing it all recursively to see the weird oddities that people might do in SPF records. Writing it all out to a weird series of files that was semi-useful to me that I could then hack and munge a little bit more. Some of the outputs then was listing out all the MX records, deduplicating them, finding some of the MX record mail servers that are configured identical to the others. So for example, everyone who uses Outlook.com as a mail server for their hosted mail, Outlook.com, all of their CNAMEs, all of their A records are configured almost identically. So I could basically take a long list of Outlook.com and bring it down to just one or two because I don't need to repeat the same thing, get the same results all the time. I was using testssl.sh from the website, testssl.sh. This went through and did all of the checks very similar to how Qualys's SSL Labs did. Went through looking at TLS and SSL cipher suites, some common vulnerabilities. Again, very similar to the web interface that you have. Allowed for outputting to CSV and JSON files, and the CSV was just the easiest way that I found for dealing with it and, you know, extracting and comparing against a large number of MX servers. I also used another tool called SSL Scan. This was very similar to testssh.sh or testssl.sh. The output format wasn't as useful for how I was doing it for a large number of servers, but I did use it for once in a while doing point-in-time validations whenever things came out a little bit weird on test SSL. I ran it through SSL Scan to see if the weirdness was still there. And then, of course, grep, awk, Excel, and some custom script to do very funky differences across very large CSV files. So I had tools to do the work. I then had to create lists of companies that I wanted to do some assessments across. So I created some lists. I purposefully went for some of the larger ones. I wanted to try and give them the best opportunity to come out with some good results. And hopefully I'd come up here and say, everything's fine. I did a lot of work, but everything is fine. Not quite so much. So I went through, I created long lists, went through the ASX 100, so 100 top companies listed on the stock exchange. I also went to the bottom end of the AXS listed companies, companies that were less than $2 million in their market cap. You know, get the small end, but still listed, still having to go through, you know, certain procedures to be on the stock exchange. Went through Australian government, went at federal as well as all the different states and territories, trying to be fairly even spread across it all. Australian charities, some of the larger big ones that are out there, top Australian ISPs, and some top international email providers where their whole deal is doing email hosting, just to do a comparison for the rest of the world. Went through looking at their domain names, looking at their company names. The important thing here was not just website domain names, but finding the domain names that they actually use for email for these companies. So thank you to privacy policies. About 80% of privacy policies actually have a usable email address in them. So therefore, I know the domain name to use for contacting them and then pulling out MX records. So looking at the ASX 100, I ended up with 95 domains to do. This was after some deduplicating where different listed companies are basically run by the same larger organization. I don't know how companies work, but you know, it's a thing, especially in the mining industry. Most of them are using some sort of hosted email service, which isn't a huge surprise here. pphosted.com, I personally had never heard of it, but 32 of the companies were using it. Outlook.com was similarly popular. Mimecast was another popular one, as well as Google, IPHMX, Message Labs, and even Trend Micro. 100% of these domains had SPF records. Great, awesome, love to see it. Strong start. The policies were split between soft fail and fail. Yeah, that's cool. One domain was actually breaking RFCs, not in a bad way, but they had 14 recursive lookups going through, and that was a little bit beyond the RFC standards, so they probably should have flattened it out a little bit. There was also one where they actually had SPF pointing off to a host, and that had a missing TXT record, so broken in a couple different ways. When it comes to DMARC, 9 domains had no DMARC policy at all, just completely blank. 33 had a DMARC policy, but it was set to none, so it didn't do anything. 15 had a DMARC policy set to quarantine, and 38 actually had a DMARC policy set to reject, so good work there. 2 domains with a DMARC policy had no reporting email, so they weren't really aware of what was maybe going wrong with their DMARC or mail coming in, although one of them had a policy set to none, so they weren't missing out on anything because their policy wasn't active at all anyways. Still in the ASX 100, for MTA STS, there was one policy for one domain, and it was set to testing, which means they wouldn't actually enforce anything. It's a good start. This is what you expect to see when someone's going through the testing and then enforcement ramp-up curve. But only one domain had any MTA STS record. No domains had a TLSA record for DANE, and one pair of SMTP servers was actually using self-signed certs. And without DANE, self-signed certs are a little bit useless. Looking down on the low end of the ASX, 13 domains were in this category. Most of them were using hosting mail services, Outlook, and Google. 100% SPF here as well, split between fail and soft fail, same as before. One domain actually had an interestingly broken SPF record. It looks like they sort of munged together domain verification text record and their SPF text record. Not appended, it was actually jammed in the middle of it. So that's actually what it is there. So the green is the SPF portion, and then the red is this domain verification jammed in the middle. So both of them would be broken. They weren't verifying their domain properly, and the SPF wouldn't be working very well either. And it's a question mark at the end of their SPF record, which means it basically isn't operating at all anyways. 2 domains had DMARC policies out of the 13. Both were set to quarantine, which is cool. Only one of them had reporting to email configured, so the other one is going blind about any problems that may be happening. None of these companies had MTA STS configured, and none of these companies had TLSA records for DANE configured either. You'll hear me say that a few times. Moving to the Australian government, the mix of federal and state and territory, I ended up with a list of 65. This is split between them all, looking at the larger departments. So again, giving them the best opportunity to shine a good light on their operations here. Things like defense, health, education, transport, police, treasury, and the premier's department as well. Compared to the ASX 100, more departments are actually hosting their own mail servers here, which is cool, nothing wrong with that. But many are still using Outlook, PHP hosted, and Mimecast. Side note here, as I was trying to find mail servers for South Australia and the ACT, they actually have centralized a lot of their email. So they're actually not running separate subdomains with separate mail servers. So like for SA, a lot of their email is run at sa.gov.au. So that was pretty cool. That led to a smaller number of domain names than what it should have been. So for the Australian government, SPF, 7 domains had $all in their main policy. This basically negates an SPF record completely. The rest were split between fail and soft fail. Again, 100% SPF coverage, so good work on the SPF side of things at least. Only one domain had no DMARC policy at all. Again, good to see there. But 24 DMARC policies were set to none, which basically turns it off. 9 was set to quarantine, and 31 was set to reject, which is, again, a pretty good number there. All domains actually had DMARC reporting email addresses configured in one way or the other. 0 domains, however, had MTA STS, and 0 domains had TLSA records for DANE. For Australian charities, we had 20 domains that I was doing analysis across. Most were using hosted mail services, 13 on Outlook.com, 4 on Mimecast. 100% SPF records here as well. Again, half and half split between fail and soft fail policies. For the charities, we had 8 domains with no DMARC record at all, 8 with their policy set to none, 3 set to quarantine, and 1 domain had their DMARC policy set to reject. So good for you, Salvation Army. All domains did have reporting email addresses set if they did have a DMARC policy, so everything was being configured fairly evenly across the board. Again, like a broken record, none of these domains had an MTA STS record, and none of these domains had DANE configured using TLSA records. Okay, let's go to Australian ISPs, some of the top ISPs. So I had 20 domains that I chose from here, trying to avoid some of the parent-child ISPs where they've been doing a lot of mergers and acquisitions amongst them. So I tried to avoid doing a lot of that in the expectation that they would, of course, have similar running mail servers. Maybe not, but expecting that. Most are running their own mail servers. Not surprising here, internet providers, typical thing to run their own mail servers. Some were using Outlook, some were using Mimecast, and a couple were using Google.com as well. For SPF, for the top ISPs, 1 domain was missing an SPF record. So this is a bit of a shock compared to all the others that we've had. 16 are soft fail, and only 3 were set to fail. Still pretty good. DMARC. 11 domains had no DMARC policy at all, 5 were set to none, and 2 were set to quarantine and reject. Again, no domains had MTA STS records, no domains had DANE TLSA records. And when I say no records, I mean absolutely none, not even set to testing mode or anything like that. So getting an example of people who do email as their job. So we're looking at email hosting providers. List of domains here just so that you get an idea of what I'm talking about here. I do go a little bit far out there, went after Yandex and mail.ru to see what it's like there. Even poking around AOL because people still use AOL apparently. They are all running their own mail servers. Of course, they're mail hosting providers. For SPF, for these providers, 1 domain was missing an SPF record. 2 domains had $all, which is as good as having no record at all, and the rest is a split between fail and soft fail. Here's where they actually start doing stuff. DMARC, 2 domains with no policy, 7 set to none, 3 set to quarantine, 5 to reject. That's not great. That's actually a little bit lower down than some of the other servers and groups of organizations that we looked at. We did have 8 domains with MTA STS. Finally, we have something of a little bit of a blip on our radar. We also had 4 domains with TLSA records configured for DANE. So we actually have the people who know how to do email doing some of the good mail security. But still, this is a very small number compared to the 20 of people who are supposed to be experts at doing mail server hosting. So, some more fun analysis here. This is not specific to the international email hosting providers. Expired certificates, we had 2 of them. Just outright, full-on expired certificates, long expired, not even like just a week ago. Anonymous ciphers. You probably don't know a lot about anonymous ciphers because nobody in their right mind would ever use an anonymous cipher, but an anonymous cipher is basically saying, we'll do some crypto, but you don't have to trust who I am, and I don't care who you are. We'll just do some crypto in the middle, and if this is a man-in-the-middle attack, I don't care. We'll encrypt it to whoever. MailGuard and Telstra, believe it or not, using anonymous ciphers. Some more interesting ones. I actually found 1 mail exchange that, well, 2 technically for the 1 company, that is still using SSL version 2. This was deprecated in 2011. If you were running a web server, still running SSL version 2, you'd probably be fired by your boss for just negligence. Why is this still happening on SMTP servers? Up a level, SSL version 3, little bit more recent, was only deprecated 8 years ago and completely removed out of web servers and browsers. We've got a list of them here. MRL.com, mining resource for one of the ASX 100. They're also using self-signed certs, so just everything they're doing is wrong. Government department in there, as well as some of the large hosting providers. Message Labs, PP Hosted, Telstra, even Yandex still have SSL version 3 enabled. I'm not quite sure what they think they're trying to accomplish by having old versions. If they're thinking backwards compatibility and making sure that mail gets through, well, it defaults to unencrypted. You know, why be running this old encryption that has known vulnerabilities to it when you can just drop it completely and push everyone up? This would stop man-in-the-middle attacks. This would stop things from being more secure. TLS version 1, still running on the big providers. There was a few that only supported TLS version 1.2, which was great to see. Barracuda, IPHMX, Mimecast, Outlook, and Sonic Healthcare. Really good to call out the people doing things correctly. It'd be nice if they also supported version 1.3, but 1.2 is good enough for now. There was a few of them that supported 1.2 as well as 1.3. So the ones you see listed there, including Aussie Broadband and Google, they actually have the newest stuff turned on. It's not hard. Like, there's not a huge cost involved here. Notably, some of the really big email hosting providers that it's their job aren't using TLS version 1.3 yet. They're not even offering it. I'm not talking about restricting to it, just offering it. Still not out there. So, recommendations. What can you do? Test your own servers. I was only doing a sampling here of different companies. Test your servers. Test the servers of your critical vendors and partners. The people that you're going to be sending email to, see what their server is accepting. See if your email going from your server to their server could be man-in-the-middle attacked due to lack of encryption, bad encryption, or just not including things like DANE and MTA STS that will nudge you in the right direction to using TLS all the time. You can also use tools that I was, Test SSL and SSL Scan. There's websites, internet.nl, based in the Netherlands, but they will scan and test anybody on the internet. AUDA, the domain people in Australia, they've worked on a site called AU Check. If you haven't heard of it, relatively new, similar to internet.nl, go there, put in your domain name, and they'll do some checks and give you some recommendations. It doesn't give you a big green A+, but it's close enough. Other recommendations, SPF, DKIM, DMARC, they're great at stopping impersonation attacks. Yeah, keep going with that. Separate talk down the line. Set up DANE if you already have DNSSEC. That's the requirement for it. If you don't have DNSSEC set up yet, set up MTA STS. Doesn't require DNSSEC. Then set up DNSSEC later on, because having integrity checks on your DNS queries and servers is probably a good thing. And remember, way back at the beginning of the presentation, I said that BGP hijacking is a way of doing man-in-the-middle attacks. Well, I work for APNIC, so I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about BGP hijacking and the fact that RPKI is a solution or part of the larger solution for BGP hijacking. So on the networking side of things, away from mail servers, have a look at RPKI and make sure that your routing security is up to date as well. And that is it. I'm getting a bit of a sign that we may not have too much time for maybe 5 minutes if anybody has questions. If you have questions, you can ask in the room or submit them via the app as well.
Jamie, what's your advice on getting the DNSSEC signatures on your domain?
Test.
If you're
test,
not a big company, right?
test, and test. DNSSEC is great, but if you don't have, well, as with any crypto, if you don't have proper processes in place for when they need to be updated, rolled over, and if anything goes wrong, then you're going to be in for a very bad time when something expires or does go wrong. So as with any crypto that you do, have it very detailed and planned out. Go through testing before you do a full deployment. But you know, DNS is another one of those things, completely unencrypted. If you're using standard DNS, which almost everybody still is. So DNSSEC is a way of giving that integrity on the records. But yeah, I've seen countries shoot themselves in the foot by not doing DNSSEC signing at the top level domain properly. So if it can happen to them, it can happen to you.
So is there a good how? The question was, is there a good how-to? Where do you go for someone's like? Can you think of a good blog where someone's going, here's what I learned, here's the best way to do it? Not APNIC.
I work for APNIC. We have a blog. We have guest authors. So it's not APNIC talking about stuff, but we do have a lot of blog posts on blog.apnic.net talking about DNSSEC implementations as well as problems and assessments of other people's problems as well. So don't think that our blog is just us who write stuff. We do get guest authors who are experts in the subjects as well.
Any more questions?
Nope.
You've been talking a lot about our, I guess, mail gateways, etc. What about the myriad of devices that vendors are providing and that are historically out there? How are you suggesting they're managed for the betterment of the community and your own companies that you work for?
So you're talking like mail server appliances?
Well,
that
you've got
you're
your
running,
printers and scanners and
Yep.
all your little client devices that are horrible to work with. But yeah, they're real.
Yeah, so the client side of things was out of scope for this presentation because that's one that is a little bit more visible, and I was really trying to go after the aspect that people aren't looking at. From the mail server side of things, it's the typical thing that you need to push back on the vendors if they're not providing you with the right updates. You know, this has happened in the past. I've been doing this for far too long now, and it just comes cyclical. You know, there's a problem, and it's like, why was the vendor not providing the updates to it? So having the conversation with the vendor, but to have that conversation, you have to know what you're missing out on. You need to dive deep, try and turn things on, try and see what extra options and how high can you bring the security levels up for your risk environment, and find out where your solution is falling down. Put the pressure back on the vendor. Why is your product not giving me these things? And if it's hosted providers, the same sort of thing. Doesn't have to be a box or a server that you're running. If you're using Outlook.com and you're not happy with what they're doing, you need to put the pressure on them. Because if they don't hear it from the customers, they think that everything's running fine and they just keep going, and people want it the way that it is. So you really need to put the pressure on the vendors.
Unfortunately, we're out of time for more questions, so could you please thank Jamie?
Thank you very much.